Today we've got Caitlin McCurrie on the line to talk tagging taxonomies. Caitlin's a lead researcher at Atlassian, and we've managed to pry her away from her current research projects to chat to her about her approach and considerations when it comes to tagging and taxonomies. Hey, welcome Caitlin. To start us off, we'd love to hear a little bit about you, your background, and what you've been working on.
I'm a lead researcher at Atlassian. In particular, my work is in the ecosystem team and marketplace team, which is very cool. I'm very lucky to have landed where I have. And so, in those teams within Atlassian, we're thinking about our third party partners, we're thinking about apps and integrations and customizations and all sorts of ways in which we extend the functionality of people's Atlassian toolkit. So, that's very cool. Prior to this, I have been in a bunch of different organizations. I started out my UX research journey actually as an academic, as many people do. I was studying psychology, particularly looking at social psychology and technology and the intercept between the two. So, where technology changes human behavior and perception of yourself and others. And so naturally, I was enjoying that, but I wanted to kind of be a bit more impactful, be a bit more practical with my research. And so I landed in UX research. And so the team that is in the ecosystem team is pretty small. It's just myself and my wonderful colleague, Cara, that we work together to support that team and their research needs.
Awesome. Let's jump into some tagging and taxonomies questions. So, starting with the foundations, I'd love to know what the term tag means to you, and when you think that you should use a tag.
Coming from a psychological background, I think about these things very much in that grounding that I got during my tertiary education. And so when I think about the tagging, I think about how we're trying to represent the things that we want to measure that are abstract concepts that we can't necessarily go and directly ask about. So we're always asking indirectly and trying to measure that indirectly. We call those latent variables. And so those latent variables could be something like how agreeable somebody is or how useful something is to someone. And in our data, we see ways in which that usefulness, for example, might be reflected in the words that they use or the things that they talk about. And so a tag is a way for me to represent how the data links to that latent variable that I'm interested in.
Yeah, cool. So, you've covered off the what. Now I was hoping we could look at the how. So, how do you tag your data, and what level of granularity do you use when tagging?
So I take the approach of all data is useful data. And so how I take something does depend a little bit on the kind of data that I have in front of me and the sort of thing that I'm interested in studying. Um, and so I guess if we're if we're tagging, say, an interview, for example, my tag would just be whatever phrase or concept or paragraph captured that latent variable that I was interested in. So that could be a big chunk of what they're saying. It might actually be part of a sentence. It really depends on what I need to represent that variable I'm interested in. And in terms of the granularity that we go to, that really depends on how granular that measure is that I'm interested in. So it might be the case that I'm interested in something really specific, like usefulness of this feature within this bit of the product, in which case we might be a bit more granular about our tags. It might be the case that it's very small snippets of things that we end up tagging versus big constructs like, if we're talking about psychology, about something like agreeableness, it's quite broad, and so we might be going a bit more broader in our tagging.
Something I think a lot of people would be interested in understanding is how you sort of approach creating a taxonomy.
I think that we have, two kinds of broad ways in which we might approach creating a taxonomy. And one of which would be a more bottom-up approach, and the other would be a more top-down approach. And I think that the bottom-up approach is probably a little bit more common when we're talking about applied research and UX research. The reason for that is bottom-up tends to happen where we don't have strong beliefs about what's going on for the thing that we're interested in. So we might not have done research before on this topic. We might not have had some academic literature or market research for us to draw from. It's probably something fairly new. That happens pretty commonly in applied research because we're practical about our time and where we spend that, and we're probably trying to focus on something we don't know a lot about. And so when you're taking a more bottom-up approach, you don't know that much about the space. And so you're still exploring it. We'd say probably in discovery research, you're discovering this topic. And so my approach to creating the taxonomy during that kind of research is I do a very fast pass through my data to begin with. So I'm going very quickly, tagging any of those constructs that I'm interested in as they come up. I'm not thinking about the language that I'm using here for my tags. Very free form and very generous about my tagging there. Just moving quickly through it, and I try to almost time myself with how fast I can go through my interviews. It's usually interviews, but it might not always be interview data. And the reason for that is just not to get caught up in the details. I'm trying to be big picture here. I'm trying to explore what constructs I can see in that data before I get too caught up in those details. And so as I'm going through that, naturally, I'm starting to see some patterns. I'm starting to see something that's interesting. I might like to get some post-it notes and start to put some post-it notes on the things that I'm observing here as I'm capturing those tags. Usually I get to about halfway through my data, and at this point in time, I'm actually seeing I have some sense of the data and I have some sense of what's going on with this topic that was pretty new to me before I started this research, but now I'm starting to see some things interesting arise out of that. And so at about the halfway mark, that's kind of my point at which I would like to stop. And then I go back to my tags and I start to refine them a little bit. And now that's when I'm starting to create that taxonomy. So as I'm starting to refine that, I'm thinking, could I have expressed that tag a little bit more succinctly? Have I captured that latent variable that I was interested in there appropriately? Do I maybe remove a little bit of that quote from that tag? Actually, maybe that's not so related to that. Maybe that's related to something else. Maybe I'll add a little description to my tag. So when you click on to the tag feature at Dovetail, there's the option to put some text below your tag. And that at this point in time, I might do that, put a little bit of information in as to what that tag represents for me, how that relates to my construct. And I'm also starting to think about redundancy here. So I've been super freeform with my tagging up until this point. And so actually, I might be kind of repeating myself. And so I might start to combine my tags. I might start to delete some tags. Now that I've got a slightly clearer picture of what constructs I'm seeing in my data, how they start to fit together, how I might talk about them, what I should expect to see in the data when I am tagging my data. Now I'll go back and I'll continue on with the other half of my interviews, whatever data I might have, and I'll start to apply a little bit more of a systematic process to the tagging of my data. So now I might think, yes, when I'm tagging this usefulness construct, I'm thinking about where people have spoken about what's good about this product and what's bad about this product. So I'm looking for specific language and I know what tags I have. So I'm looking to apply those tags to the second half of my data. And I might even come back to the first half of my data depending on how much time I have in my project. And I might then start to refine those tags as they apply to those first half. So I might try to be a little bit more systematic in what tags are where. Now, as I sort of come to the end of the first tagging phase, I will then start to polish out that taxonomy that I've created. And that taxonomy now reflects my understanding of the subject. And as I've been doing the second half of my tagging, I've been continuing to take those post-it notes and memos for myself about the patterns that I'm seeing in the data. And so that taxonomy now is going to help me to understand the patterns and the relationships between those constructs. So I'll now go and review my taxonomy and say, I think that this thing here actually leads into this other thing here, and this is the relationship between these different constructs. And this might actually tell me something specific about the things that I'm interested in, the things that I'm studying in my research project. And that's when we start to move into the insights phase of this. And so I might do a little bit more polishing here. I might continue to refine down my tags a little bit, continue to be a little bit more targeted and succinct with my language about how I describe that tag and where it's applied and how the description of the tag, how it's curated, I suppose. And then that's kind of the end of my bottom-up process of creating my taxonomy. And so now I've got this taxonomy that can then be used in, say, a follow-up study where we might have a bit more of that second approach, which I was mentioning is the top-down approach to creating that taxonomy. So in the top-down approach, I'm in a phase of research where I have some existing data, I have some existing insights. Maybe I've done something in an earlier project that's directly related to this. I have a sense of the topic and what might be going on here. Say this is a secondary follow-up study to the one I was just describing. I already have that taxonomy. So I might be now just adjusting my taxonomy a little bit and then applying it to a second round of data collection.
You mentioned your experience as an academic. How do you pull inspiration from the approach that you learned and use that to inform your applied research?
I get inspiration from the systematic literature reviews that I used to do during my academic time. And so a systematic literature review is very rigorous, very thoughtful. You're going in with very clear ideas about what sort of data you're expecting to see, how you're going to explore that data, how you define if something is relevant to your area of interest or not. And as part of that process, really, you create a taxonomy for yourself for how you would code the data that you come across. So I would like to share, if that's okay, an example of how I have done this previously as an academic. And obviously this is more than what we would need to apply as applied researchers, but this kind of gives us some inspiration of how we might go about this. So in this research that I'm drawing from as an example, there was a lot of study on this topic already. So there's a lot of academic research, but it might be the case that there's a lot of market research or a lot of research within the organization that you can draw from that tells you something about the constructs that you're interested in. And those constructs lead us to have certain hypotheses about what we were going to search, how we were going to search for them, and what we were going to find. In this case, we were actually interested in the impacts of technology on certain moral behaviors. Hopefully you can see that correctly. And so here, this is a very, very, very detailed table of how the people working with me would go about searching and analyzing this data. And so some of this is not relevant to us. So some of this is actually telling them how to go about searching for this. But what was quite interesting here is that as part of this process, we actually defined what keywords they would need to input to search for the literature that we're interested in. And then we told them, the team that I was working with, when they were going through the literature that they would find, what they would need to do in order to tag something accordingly. So let's just go down to where we can find the actual tag examples. Okay, so here, for example, what we find is that here we go. So where, for example, someone saw moral or ethic or judgment, then they would need to assign that as a certain tag, moral psychology relevant. They also needed to tag whether something was related to certain features of that study, like for example, whether they were studying blame in this case, whether they were studying another feature of moral psychology. I think it was whether somebody was judging, whether it was right or wrong. And so we would tell people, if you saw this thing, then you should tag it like this. If you see this language here, then you should tag like this. And this is extremely structured, extremely rigorous approach that was preparing it for actually academic publication. And so we ended up with an Excel spreadsheet where people were filling in what they found and what they tagged for each of these numbers here actually refers to a published paper that the team went through and tagged individually. And this is far more than what we would need in applied research, and far more difficult because we didn't have a tool like Dovetail at that point in time. But it can give us inspiration as to how we would approach this in an applied format. And so in an applied format, maybe what I would be doing here is thinking about what I know of this subject. So I know that in my topic of interest, people are going to talk about, I'm just going to take my, people are going to talk about judgment. They're going to talk about blame. They're going to talk about right and wrong, because those are the words that people use when they talk about the subject. I know this because I've already read some research on this. I've already seen my colleagues work on this. And so as I'm preparing my taxonomy for how I'm going to approach my analysis, I can say, when we see these words, we're going to apply this tag. When we see this, we will apply this. And so it's a lot more structured in our approach, and it only really works when we have this very strong existing belief of what we're going to see in our data.
Now that you are an applied researcher, could you give us an example of a time at Atlassian when you've used that top-down approach?
So this is a really cool example of how we have applied a very loose version of that taxonomy when I was working with a design team to work through the analysis of actually community posts. So all of these notes here that you can see on screen are posts from the community. And what we wanted to do here was go through and tag them and see if we could see different kinds of issues come up, if we could actually get an understanding of what people were talking about, why they were talking about them, and what was going on for these users when they were going to post on community. And so as part of that, the design team and myself will sort of split up the work. So all of these designers were tagging a subset of the community threads themselves, because obviously I don't have time in the day to tag the 50 or so community threads that we actually looked at here. And so in order to help the design team get through this and know how to tag it and have some consistency across all of our work so that we could bring it all together and we could actually understand what was going on, what I did here was create a very, very loose taxonomy to give them some guidance as to how to approach it. So what we've got here is some instructions on how they should approach the tagging based on what sort of things we know about our community at Atlassian already from the research that we've already done, what sort of language that we expect, and when they see this kind of language, how they should tag. And then I've also given them a couple of examples, which is something we also do in academic research too. So a couple of examples of how if you see this kind of data, this is how you should be tagging it, and followed by this example. And so that actually worked really fantastically. I'm very lucky to work with the team that I do work with. We were able to get through a lot of data together by splitting up the load and using this taxonomy, this more top-down taxonomy approach here to get through that data. Something that's interesting here, though, in particular, is that this one was a little bit more of a blend between the top-down and the bottom-up approach. So here, even though I was predefining it for the design team and giving them that guidance, they also had scope to create their own tags, make some changes, note some observations that they had. And so they actually made their own tags as well. They made their own observations out of this and then shared that back to me. And if we were to have extended this further, we can build on that shared knowledge and shared work of not only my observations, but also what they started to tag as well. So we could extend that taxonomy to then apply it to another round if we want to do that later.
Hearing about the collaborative analysis was really cool. Do you often include your stakeholders when you're creating or maintaining a taxonomy?
We do. It does depend largely on the project and how engaged the team is in that project and whether we see this taxonomy is actually going to live beyond the research that we're working on. So if we're thinking that taxonomy might apply to additional studies after this, or perhaps we want to extend that to not only my research, but maybe also some product management-led research and help give them guidance on how they can tag it, then in that case, we would want to bring in the stakeholders earlier on in that tagging and do a more collaborative analysis approach where they can be more engaged and involved in that process and have some ownership over the taxonomy especially if they are intending to use it themselves. I guess the other example of where we do bring in our stakeholders earlier on in the process is where we have very technical domain, and this is something that we find often as more technical researchers. Obviously at Atlassian we're working with developer community very often, talking about technical tools and technical requirements, and I'm not an engineer, and I would make a very bad engineer, actually. So I need those domain experts to come along the journey with me and create those taxonomies with me and tag those things with me, because there are things that I might miss because I simply don't have the domain knowledge to recognize that bit is important or that bit is signaling this thing to us. And so in those cases, it's really, really important, and we do bring those on and those people along the journey with us. And on the flip side of that, occasionally there will be times where the timeline is really tight, or we really just need to get this project done, and in which case we might go into our researcher metaphorical hole and just kind of focus in, dig down, go through that data ourselves, and we might not be taking the same collaborative approach. It does just really depend on what the project looks like, what sort of things we're dealing with, and how much time we have to involve everybody in our journey.
Awesome. And when it comes to creating taxonomies, do you use different types of taxonomies for different types of research? Like, let's say, evaluative and generative?
I think they kind of map broadly onto that top-down versus bottom-up process. So the generative tends to be more more of that bottom-up discovery research. Because you're doing generative work, you probably don't know as much about the topic. It's probably new, not necessarily so, but generally, I think you'd have less confidence and less ability to actually put together something ahead of time and then apply that to your data versus actually just trying to discover the data as you go through it. Whereas with evaluative research, it sort of broadly maps onto that more top-down process where you probably have some existing data on this topic already. You hopefully have done maybe some discovery research before you come to that stage in your journey, hopefully. Maybe if you haven't, it can be a good reflecting moment as to whether that would be helpful. And as such, you might be doing more of that top-down approach because you have a good sense of what you're going to expect people to talk about. You have a bit more of an idea of what you're expecting to see in the data. And I guess you could also have some templates that you generally apply to evaluative research, which we've kind of done previously, although they're very, very broad. Because when we're doing evaluative research, I think that's more consistency in what we generally expect to see people talk about. Like the content of what they talk about might vary a little bit, but the structure of our approach can be a lot more consistent. By that I mean, people talking about the stuff that they like, the stuff that they dislike, the things that they would like to change. And so we might have some existing taxonomy templates that are generic to domain that we can then apply to be a little bit faster in our approach. And it's kind of top down as well, because we know that when we do evaluative research, this is the sort of stuff that people tend to talk about because that's how people evaluate stuff.
Moving away a little bit from tags and taxonomies, but still within the realm of analyzing data, I'm curious to hear how you use fields.
Fields I see as attributes about the person or the thing that, like, the data point that you're studying. So, like in the example that I gave about the community posts, the attributes of the community post or the poster in community. And so they would be things like their how long they've been on community, how many posts they've done on community, do they answer other people's posts? So maybe I'll call them like a problem solver versus a problem asker, those sorts of attributes like that. And the fields are used both in a kind of categorical fashion as well as a more numerical fashion. By that I mean, like, I might do the problem solver versus problem asker kind of stuff versus what's your CSAT score, the numerical data. And I use those quite heavily to help me look at patterns about what those different types of individuals express in that data. So I will do things like, maybe if we're doing some evaluative testing, do the grumpier people in my sample resonate with this concept differently to the happier people who just love our products no matter what, and that will help me get some insight as to whether we can focus on ways in which we can make some people that are struggling with our product and being a bit frustrated be a bit happier. Or I might be looking for patterns of different types of needs if I was doing more discovery research across different types of individuals. So, maybe we have a certain segment that we know are out there versus another kind of segment. And we want to make sure that when we're building new products, we're building products that serve both kinds of segments. So I might see if the tags that I've been tagging in the data are more or less frequent on one segment versus the other. And that would give me the grounding for some hypotheses about what I think are going on with the different segments in my population of interest. I might look at the frequency, like see if it's more or less frequent. And then I might also look at like the language within that. So I will do things like filter a highlight table on whether somebody is, say, a high CSAT, and then I'll look at the data, and then I'll look at low CSAT, and I'll see, are they using different language in the tags that I've like attached to that data? As they're different distributions of those tags, like am I tagging more stuff for one than the other? What kinds of things can I see about this group and what the patterns across the data? So I see, I find that the fields function very useful to help explore the attributes and how it relates to the tags that I've attached to their data.
And then the last question here is, what's your advice for people that feel some level of stress about tagging?
My advice is that like this tagging and the taxonomies is literally just a vehicle to help you understand the data, and it doesn't have to be perfect. And we're not academics now, thankfully. And so you can use it as best you need to get your understanding of the data. And if that means maybe you're more comfortable using a top down approach every time, even though it doesn't necessarily look like the right thing on paper, do that. It's fine. If you get all caught up in making the exact right language around your tag and what it's called, don't worry about it. It doesn't need to be perfectly described because it's just to help you understand what's going on with the data. So I feel like when people take a little bit of pressure off themselves to think that it has to be perfect and just see it as a vehicle to help you, then I find that the people that I work with are a little bit more confident about tackling it. You don't have to have a PhD to do this.
There you have it. Tags and taxonomies are just vehicles to help you understand your data. Tune in next time when we get another guest on the line to talk about tagging taxonomies.